Welcome to Mountain Strong. This week we are at Campbell Creek, which, as I mentioned in the last video, is a creek that cross-sects the city of Anchorage. And I mentioned that we were at one of the parks along that creek, but I didn't mention which one. If you happen to be in Anchorage, or you happen to be coming to Anchorage and you want to have a look at Campbell Creek, the park that I'm at is not one of the nicer ones. It just has a special place in my memory. I'll let you go back to the first video to find out why. But it really is located, if you just happen to want to come, at the corner of Lake Otis and Tudor. Today we're going to have a look at the third psalm together. And the third psalm gives us a wonderful opportunity to talk about two things that will help us in our study of the psalms going forward. One is that you'll notice that this psalm has a heading before the first verse. And you might be wondering in studying the psalms what those headings are all about. So the headings of the psalms represent old, uninspired, and that's an important point, uninspired tradition regarding the psalms. And so what you're seeing there reflects an old opinion about oftentimes the historical content or sometimes the musical content of the psalm that comes beneath it. And so in these headings, what I want us to do is obviously to observe them, but to always take them with a grain of salt. Sometimes they will be helpful, sometimes they won't be helpful. The second thing that I want to talk about before we get into this psalm is a word that we're going to see in the psalm itself, and that's the word Selah. Now, the word Selah is untranslated in most of the versions of the Bible that I've seen. In fact, I don't know that I've seen a translation of the word. And the reason is because people really don't know what this term means. The evidence that we have from the Greek version of the Old Testament, the ancient Greek version of the Old Testament, has this word meaning something like a pause, or maybe even a call to be louder. Of those two definitions, taking Selah across the Psalms, I am more in favor of having a look at this term as meaning a pause, because usually the term comes after some statement that demands just a little bit more reflection. And so when we read the Psalms, let's remember to pause at those moments where the Psalm seems to indicate for us to do so. As we get into the third psalm, we see the heading, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. Now, with this heading, we are going to again take it with a grain of salt, and we'll realize upon reading this that, yeah, this psalm was probably written by David. It may very well have been written on the occasion of him fleeing from Absalom his son, and that helps us to appreciate the fact that the psalms were written by real people with real struggles, sometimes with struggles that are beyond what really we can understand. But in actually reading the content of the psalm, you're not going to read any details that point to Absalom or the struggle that David is having with him. And that is, I think, the beauty of the Psalms. The Psalms provide us with a picture of suffering that someone is going through, and it provides us with this beautiful ability through its genericness to be able to insert our own suffering into the person's suffering who's writing the psalm. And so when we're studying this psalm, and we're studying all psalms of this type, we are going to try to insert ourselves into the psalm to the degree that that's helpful to us. When we see Psalm 3, and when we see psalms like it, we're going to see what I'm going to refer to, with no disrespect to the psalmist at all, kind of quick and easy responses to the problems that we face. The response that we see in the psalm is quick and easy because the psalms are, relatively short, not because the process is easy. And so what we need to do when we're going through difficulties is we need to see if our difficulty matches up with the difficulty that we're seeing in the psalm. And if we don't match up with that psalm exactly, then what I would suggest is to go ahead and move on to a different psalm until we find one that more matches with our experience. And so again, we're going to be seeing in this psalm a struggle and a response to that struggle. If it doesn't mirror your struggle, if the response doesn't seem to fit what would be helpful to you, then find the psalm that matches with your struggle. Having said all that, let's go ahead and get into the psalm itself. Verse 1. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. As we get into the words of this psalm, we notice that in the first couple of verses, the psalmist is facing a problem. This particular problem is a problem in which some foes are rising up against him, and in fact many are rising up against him. And there are many others. I don't know if this in verse 2 refers to the foes themselves, or maybe other people who are observing this problem. Many others who are actually saying of the psalmist that there is no salvation for him in God. And so they're looking at him and saying, you've got all these foes, you're supposed to be a servant of God, and yet your God is not delivering you from your foes. As he reflects upon that problem, he pauses and he comes to a realization. You know, whenever we face problems, sometimes we just need to stop and actually take stock of the situation, do a little bit of reflecting, and we might come to the realization that he does in verse 3. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. His realization is that even though he is surrounded by foes, and even though there are many who are saying that God has basically abandoned him, he's looking at his relationship with God and he's saying, that's not true. Lord, you are a shield about me. You're my glory. You're the very reason I have to lift up my head. And so what does he do, realizing he has that relationship? He doesn't believe the people who are saying that all hope is lost and God doesn't care about him. He turns to God, and in verse 4, it says, I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Now, read verse 4, where it says, he answered me from his holy hill, and then go down to verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Now, wait a minute, I thought he was answered. Why does he need to be saved? Just a few verses later, as another horde surrounded him again? As you think about the psalm, realize something about the psalm that teaches us something very important about prayer. The psalms demonstrate prayer from the standpoint of faith. When we pray in faith, and this is what James had to say about it, you pray in faith, nothing wavering, then what happens? The Lord answers your prayer. But James said that if anybody's wavering, if anybody's doubting, if anybody approaches that, he's a double-minded man, and he's not going to receive anything of the Lord in the first chapter there of the book of James. So when you see people in the Psalms praying, they pray, and then they see the solution to their problem. And so he says, I cried to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. That doesn't mean that God necessarily spoke to him, even though that's not without the realm of possibility from the standpoint of the Old Testament. It means probably that he saw the Lord responding to him because he knew the Lord heard him. He had heard him in the past, and now he was hearing him at this present time. Now, what did this realization of verse 3 and the prayer of verse 4, what did this allow the psalmist to do that he had not been able to do up until this point? It says in verse 5, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. This problem was keeping the psalmist up. And it was so troubling him that he couldn't go to sleep. But then he reflected upon his relationship with God. He prayed, and he turned that problem over to God, hearing through the eye of faith or through the ear of faith that response from God. And he was able to go to sleep. You know, sometimes when we're facing a problem, the best thing that we can do for ourselves is to reflect upon what really matters, reflect upon our relationship with God, pray about it, and then go to sleep, turning that problem effectively over to God. A wise person once told me that there are three parts of any equation to any problem. The part that you yourself have to deal with, the part that the other person has to deal with, and the part that God has to deal with. The psalmist is surrounded by foes. He can't change their part. All he can do is bring God into the picture, which he does. And so he brings God into the picture. There's nothing more for him to do, and so he goes to sleep. An amazing thing happens to him when he does those three things: reflect, pray, and sleep. In verse number 6, he wakes up, and it says, I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Where did that confidence come from? It came from reflecting upon his relationship with God, praying about his problem, and then going to sleep. Now, when we get to Psalm 4 next time, you're going to notice that there are problems that really kind of keep us awake and prevent us from sleeping. But sometimes, if your problem is such that you can commit it to God and go to sleep, sometimes that's the best thing for you to do. And sometimes you wake up with confidence because the problem doesn't seem so dark. Things seem really dark at nighttime. And things can, often take a new perspective in the light of day. Now, the problem hasn't gone away. In verse 7 it says, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God." This problem is still there, but he's now equipped to handle it from the standpoint of faith. He's not interested in what people are saying about his soul, verse 2, anymore. He's not even interested in the people who are surrounding him, verse 1. He has committed it to God. He knows God can save him. He's going to be persistent in prayer because God always expects us to be persistent in prayer. But he trusts God to do what God will do. He says, "For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked." We're going to leave for a future discussion, a discussion of what this is. This is what sometimes is called an imprecatory element, where the psalmist is sort of cursing his enemies. That's going to be something that we see through the Psalms. We'll deal with it later. For now, I want us to reflect upon the fact that what the New Testament teaches us is true. Vengeance belongs to God. And so the psalmist is simply calling God to exact vengeance upon his enemies. He does this because not only does vengeance belong to the Lord, but verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord, and your blessing be on your people. I love what the psalmist has done in showing us how to get back to a point of confidence. And I hope that when we face our problems, we can do what the psalmist does here in this psalm, reflect upon our relationship with God, to pray about our problems specifically to God, and then to go to sleep, to wake up with newfound confidence.